Solve it, and I'll marry you." Dean Victoria Ashford said it into a microphone in front of 200 students, one hand still gripping the sleeve of the janitor she had just yanked away from the board. Her chalk tapped the equation her doctoral candidates had failed to break for 6 weeks. Whitmore's largest lecture hall shook with laughter. Preston Brooks leaned his mop against the wall. He took a piece of chalk from the tray and climbed the 3 steps to the platform, and the laughter began to thin. For 15 years he had cleaned that room after midnight. For 15 years nobody had asked what he did in it once the lights went out. The night custodial shift at Whitmore University ran from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, and Preston Brooks had worked it for 15 years without missing more than a handful of nights. He had a route. The science annex first, then the humanities corridor, then the 2 long staircases, and he saved Holloway Hall, the mathematics building, for last. The other men on his crew assumed this was because Holloway sat closest to the parking lot. It was not. He was 46 years old. His uniform was gray and had been washed so many times that the Whitmore crest on the chest had gone the color of dishwater. He kept his keys on a retractable clip at his hip because a loose ring made noise, and Preston did not like making noise. Students who passed him on the stairs sometimes said hello, and he said hello back, and neither of them remembered it an hour later. That was the whole of his public life on that campus. A gray shape with a cart. A man who moved through the rooms after everyone in them had gone home. A photograph was taped inside the door of his supply closet, and it was the only thing on that campus that belonged to him. A woman with dark hair pulled back badly, laughing at something outside the frame, one hand shielding a page from the wind. Her name had been Clara. She had gotten sick the first time 15 years earlier. Preston was 3 years into a doctoral program at Ridgemont when the diagnosis came. He had started late. He was 31, and Clara, 2 years younger, had gone straight through and was 3 years ahead of him, and had been the reason he applied at all. She was the better mathematician. Everyone who taught them both said so, including Clara. One of them was going to have to earn money that did not depend on a stipend. So Preston walked into his advisor's office on a Tuesday in October, withdrew without explanation, and took the first job that came with health coverage and a shift he could work while somebody else slept. Clara recovered. That was the thing nobody counted on. She had 9 good years, and in them Lily was born and the debt came down, and twice Preston sat at the kitchen table with an application in front of him and did not send it. The illness returned 6 years ago, and it took 11 months. Then Clara died, and there was a funeral, and a house, and a 5-year-old girl who kept asking when her mother's things were going to be put back where they belonged. Lily Brooks was 10 now, going on 11 with her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's habit of arguing with the television. She went to bed at 9 with a neighbor, Mrs. Delacroix, from the unit downstairs, sitting in the living room with the door open, and woke at 6:30 to find her father already at the kitchen table with breakfast made because he came off shift, drove straight home, and did not sleep until she had gone to school. He slept from 8 until 1:30 and picked her up at 3. That was the shape of his days, and he had never complained about it to anyone. What nobody at Whitmore knew, not his supervisor, not the crew he ate lunch with, not the 400 faculty whose offices he emptied every night, was what happened in the last 40 minutes of his shift. He finished Holloway around 5:20, wheeled his cart into the ground floor lecture hall with its sloped seating and 3 long chalkboards on tracks, and wiped the boards down as he was supposed to. And then most nights he stopped. The boards at Whitmore were never fully erased. Professors left things behind, half a proof a diagram, a chain of substitutions abandoned when the bell rang. Preston read them the way other men read the sports page, standing in the dark with the cart parked behind him, following somebody else's thinking to the place where it broke. Sometimes he could see where it broke. Sometimes he could see further than that. He kept a notebook in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket, and it was not his. The cover was soft green cloth worn white at the corners, and the small, slanted handwriting inside belonged to a woman 5 years dead. Clara had filled 200 pages before the illness came back, and 11 more after, and the final entry was a single line written in a hospital bed with a pencil she could barely hold. Preston had never shown that notebook to anyone, or told anyone at Whitmore that it existed, or that there had been 3 years at Ridgemont, or that a dissertation advisor had once believed he was going to be somebody. Some of the reasons were about money, and one was about a girl who needed at least one parent to be reliably in the same place every afternoon. But the real reason, the one he did not examine often, was that going back would have meant opening that notebook in front of strangers, and he was not ready for anyone else to touch what was inside it. So he stayed. He mopped the floors, and at 5:20 in the morning, alone in a room that smelled of chalk dust and floor wax, he let himself think for 40 minutes, and then he put the notebook away and drove home to make his daughter breakfast. He had done this for 15 years, and it had cost nobody anything. In the second week of September, that stopped being true. Victoria Ashford had been chair of the mathematics department for 10 months, and she had spent all 10 of them, proving she deserved it. She was 41, the youngest department head in Whitmore's history, and the first woman to hold the position, and she had come from a research post at Ridgemont Whitmore's sister institution across the state, which supplied roughly a third of its faculty. She arrived with 2 major publications and a reputation for being unpleasant in exactly the way that gets a person promoted. Her lectures were brilliant, her office hours brief. She had a way of listening to a student's question, with her head tilted slightly, that made most of them stop halfway through and apologize. At the start of the fall term, she announced what the department was calling the Ashford problem within a day. It was a conjecture that had sat unresolved in the literature for 30 years. Victoria had spent 2 years building an approach to it, and she was confident enough in that approach to do something dramatic. She wrote the central obstruction on the board of the ground floor lecture hall in Holloway, in her own hand, announced that the board would not be erased until it was resolved, and attached a research fellowship to it. $60,000 and a named position, funded out of a private endowment she had personally secured to whoever closed the gap. She expected one of her own doctoral candidates to do it inside a month, using her framework under her supervision. That was the point. It was not a competition, so much as a demonstration. 6 weeks went by. The board stayed up. 4 candidates took runs at it and produced 4 dead ends, and by the middle of October, the thing had stopped being exciting and started being embarrassing, and Victoria had begun to snap at people in seminar. Then, on a Thursday morning, she came in early and found that the board had been written on. Not erased. Written on. Beneath her obstruction in the lower right corner where there was empty space, someone had worked a short chain of substitutions in a cramped, slanted hand. 6 lines. It ended without a conclusion, the way a person stops when they run out of time rather than out of thought. She stood in front of it for a long while. Then she photographed it, took it back to her office, and worked through it twice. It was not wrong. That was the part that unsettled her. It was not her method. It did not resemble her method. It went somewhere her method could not go, and it did not contain a single error she could find. Her first assumption was that a colleague was playing a game with her. Her second was that one of her candidates had gotten help from outside. When she checked the hall on Friday morning and found 2 more lines added, she went to campus security and asked for the overnight footage. The officer pulled it up and scrubbed forward until the timestamp read 5:26 in the morning. A man in a gray custodial uniform wheeled a cart into frame, parked it at the base of the platform, and stood looking at the board with his hands at his sides. He stayed that way for almost 4 minutes. Then he took a piece of chalk from the tray, wrote for perhaps 90 seconds, stepped back, looked at what he had written, and set the chalk down. He took a small green notebook from his jacket, opened it, had read something, and closed it again. Then he pushed his cart out of the room. Victoria asked the officer to run it a second time. She watched it all the way through without saying anything at all. "That's Preston," the officer said. "Night crew. He's been here longer than I have." Victoria could have walked down to the custodial office that afternoon and asked the man what he was doing and where he had learned to do it. Every honest instinct she had left told her that was the correct move, and for about an hour, she almost made it. But she had come up in departments where being wrong in public was the only thing that could actually kill you, and she had spent 10 months knowing exactly how many people were waiting for her to slip. If it got out that the gap in her framework had been walked over by a janitor with a piece of chalk, that the answer had been sitting on her own board every morning while her candidates flailed, she would not survive it as a story. Stories were what ended people, not mathematics. Stories. So she decided to make it a joke before anyone else could make it a scandal. The mandatory department colloquium was set for the following Wednesday at 11 in the morning in Holloway Hall, and attendance was required for every graduate student and undergraduate major in the program. 206 people signed in at the door. 2 days before it, Victoria sent a request to custodial services asking that the floors of the hall be serviced during that window, and specifying that the work go to the overnight staff member responsible for the building. Ray Doyle, who ran the crew, and had learned not to ask department chairs why, called Preston at home on Tuesday and offered him 90 minutes of overtime. Preston took it. They needed the money, and it was the first thing anyone in that building had ever asked him for by name. He came in at 11:20 with his mop and bucket, saw the full room, and stopped in the doorway the way anyone would. "Come in," Victoria said into the microphone. "Please, don't let us interrupt you." Laughter scattered and uncertain. Preston lifted a hand slightly and started to back out. "No, I insist." She came down off the platform and crossed to him, and there was something almost friendly in it, which was what made it work. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks has been cleaning this room for 15 years. As it turns out, he has also been doing mathematics in it. On my board, in the middle of the night." The laughter came properly, then 200 people who did not know what they were laughing at and laughed anyway, because the woman with the microphone had told them it was funny. Preston stood very still with the mop handle in both hands. Victoria went back up to the board and picked up the chalk. "Since we have him," she said, "let's take advantage. 6 weeks, 4 candidates, no progress. Mr. Brooks, you've been generous with your notes. Perhaps you'd like to finish the job in front of witnesses." She wrote a second expression beneath the first, harder than anything she had put in front of her own students, and underlined it twice. Then she turned around, caught his sleeve as he moved to leave, and set it into the microphone with a smile so wide it reached the back row. "Solve it, and I'll marry you." The hall came apart. Somebody in the third row was filming on a phone, which Victoria noticed and did not mind, because in her version of the afternoon, the video was a joke that made her look human. Preston set his bucket down against the baseboard. He stood there for the length of a breath, and then he crossed to the tray, chose a piece of chalk, and went up the 3 steps without hurrying. The sound in the room began to thin out into something else. He did not touch the second expression. He went to the first, the one that had stood untouched for 6 weeks, and laid the chalk against its third line. The line in Victoria's own hand. The foundation her entire 2-year framework rested on. "This is where it fails," he said. His voice was quiet and did not carry well, and 200 people leaned forward to hear it. "Not at the obstruction. Here, you've assumed the mapping stays bounded when you extend the domain. It doesn't. There's a case you're not covering." He wrote 4 lines constructing the case plainly the way a man might show someone the crack in a foundation wall. "Everything after this point inherits the error," he said. "Your candidates haven't been failing. They've been doing exactly what you told them to do, and it can't work. That's why nobody's gotten through in 6 weeks." He set the chalk back in the tray, and the small click of it was audible in every seat. Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. In the front row, one of Victoria's own doctoral candidates was staring at the board with her hand over her mouth, working through it and getting there. Victoria Ashford did not say a word. The colloquium ended 18 minutes early, and nobody could later agree on how only that Victoria had said something about reconvening and walked out through the side door without collecting her notes. Preston picked up his mop and did the floor along the back row and down the center aisle, because that was what he had been paid 90 minutes to do, and 200 people watched him in a silence nobody seemed able to break. Then he clocked out at 12:40 and drove home and slept for an hour before it was time to get Lily from school. He did not tell his daughter anything about it. By 4 that afternoon, the video was on 3 student accounts. By Thursday, it had climbed past 200,000 views under the caption, "Dean tells janitor she'll marry him if he solves it. Watch her face." Victoria watched her own face 9 times. What she saw was not the humiliation. It was the 4 lines. She had gone back to Holloway that evenings with the doors locked and worked his counterexample from the ground up, twice looking for the seam. There was no seam. The mapping did not stay bounded. 2 years of scaffolding had a rotten beam in it, and a man with a mop had put his finger on the exact board. She could have written a correction and published it herself. Nobody would have known. But 400,000 people had now watched a janitor tell a room full of her own students that her candidates had not been failing, and by the following Tuesday, the provost's office had called twice. So on Thursday morning, 8 days after the colloquium, Victoria Ashford did what she had spent her career doing when cornered. She escalated. The meeting was held in the provost's conference room, and Preston was summoned to it at 10 in the morning, 2 hours into what should have been his sleep. He came in his uniform because he did not own a suit and had not been told he needed one. There were 7 people at the table. Provost Nathaniel Reed sat at the head of it, a heavy, tired man who had been at Whitmore for 22 years and wanted very badly for this to go away quietly. Victoria did not want it to go away. "Mr. Brooks has made a claim," she said, in front of 200 witnesses, about the integrity of a research program this university funds. "I'm not disputing the counterexample. I'm accepting it. What I'm saying is that identifying a flaw is not the same as producing a result, and I think Mr. Brooks knows the difference." She proposed it as though it were a courtesy. The fellowship would stand. It was open to anyone who closed the gap, and the endowment did not care about job titles. But Preston Brooks would have 14 days to produce a complete and defensible resolution, presented in full before a review committee of the mathematics faculty. "And if he can't," Reed said, "then this university has an employee who interfered with active research materials on university property night after night without authorization." She let that sit exactly long enough, which is a custodial services matter, not mine. Preston understood then that there had never been an offer. The provost looked down the table with something like apology in his face. "Mr. Brooks, you're not required to accept." "He is, if he wants to keep working here," said Ray Doyle, who had been brought in to sit at the far end and had not wanted to say anything at all. "That's what she just said. That's what she means." Preston had his hands flat on the table. He was aware of the uniform of the keys clipped at his hip, of the fact that he had not slept and had to be awake for his daughter at 3. 14 days, he said. "I work nights, all 14 of them. I'm not giving up the shift, and I'll need somewhere to work. Not the hall. Somewhere I can leave things out." Reed granted him a disused seminar room on the 3rd floor of Holloway Room 314, with a key that Preston clipped onto his ring beside the 9 he already carried. It had a chalkboard, a table, 4 chairs, and a window facing the parking lot. That was where the second half of October went. He slept from 8 in the morning until 1:30. He picked Lily up at 3, made dinner, sat with her while she did fractions at the kitchen table, and did not once tell her that her father was doing something related. At 9, Mrs. Delacroix came up from downstairs with her knitting and settled into the chair by the door. At 10, Preston clocked in. He ran his route faster than he ever had, cutting 40 minutes out of 8 hours by moving the way a man moves when something is waiting for him. And from 2 until 5:30, he was in room 314 with the door shut and the green notebook open on the table. What he was looking for was not in that notebook. He had known that for 5 years. What was in it? In it was the way Clara had thought. So he sat under a fluorescent light in a borrowed room and tried night after night to think like his wife. On the 5th night, someone knocked at 11 minutes past 2 in the morning. Preston opened the door to an old man in a raincoat holding a cardboard document box against his hip. "Harold Webb," the old man said. "I was in the 3rd row on Wednesday. I don't expect you noticed." He was 73, professor emeritus of mathematics at Whitmore for 9 years, which meant an office he rarely used a parking permit and no vote in anything. Before that, he had spent 19 years on the faculty at Ridgemont. He came in without being invited, set the box on the table, and looked at the chalkboard with his hands in his coat pockets. "You've got the whole left half wrong," he said. "I know." "Do you?" Webb pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "Then why is it still up there?" "Because I don't have anything better yet," Preston said, "and I'd rather look at a wrong thing than a blank board." Webb made a sound that was not quite a laugh and pushed the box across the table. Inside were 3 bound volumes, gray-covered, printed on paper gone brown at the edges. A Ridgemont conference proceedings out of print for 31 years, on a technique that had fallen out of fashion because the field moved somewhere else. Nobody had cited any of it in 2 decades. Webb had them because Webb had been in the room when they were presented. "There's a construction in the 2nd volume," he said. "4th paper. It's clumsy and it's ugly, and it was written by a man who died without ever getting a chair anywhere. It won't solve your problem." He stood and buttoned his coat. "But you're trying to build a bridge with your hands, son, and that's a set of tools." Preston looked at it for a while. "Why?" he said. "Because I watched a woman with a microphone make a room laugh at you," Webb said. "And then I watched you break her framework in 90 seconds. I've been at this a very long time, Mr. Brooks. I know what it looks like when somebody has been thinking about something every day for 15 years. He put a hand on the door frame. "Also, I knew your wife." Preston did not move. "Not well. She sat in on my seminar at Ridgemont for 1 term, and she asked better questions than anybody I had that year." Webb glanced at the green notebook lying open on the table and did not comment on it. "I read that she'd died. I didn't know until it was 3 years past. I'm sorry." He left. He came back on the 7th night and the 9th, always after 2, always in the raincoat, and he never brought anything else. He would sit and read whatever was on the board and say things like, "You're assuming that's finite," or "No, do it the other way, you'll lose the sign." He never picked up the chalk. When Preston asked once whether he wanted to write, Webb said that if he put so much as a comma on that board, Victoria Ashford would eat both of them alive. The construction in the 4th paper worked. Not for the whole problem. It got Preston through a region he had been stuck in for 4 nights and left him on the 10th day at the edge of the thing itself, the gap that had stood for 30 years where every published attempt had stopped and turned around. He stood in front of it at 5 in the morning and understood with complete clarity that everything he had done so far was the easy part. Victoria understood something similar around the same time, and it did not come from the board. It came from Grace Whitfield, her 2nd-year candidate, the one who had sat in the front row with her hand over her mouth. Grace had gone up to the 3rd floor on the 9th evening to return a folder, looked through the door glass, and reported what Victoria did not want to hear. "He's past the transition," Grace said. "The whole left board is past it. I don't know how he got there, but he's not where we were. He's not even in the same direction." That night, Victoria walked up to the 3rd floor at 10 o'clock, when the room was empty, and Preston was still down in the science annex, and let herself in with her master key. She was very good at her job. It took her 9 minutes to see that it was going to close. Then she waited. He came in at 2 and found her sitting in one of the 4 chairs with her coat still on, and she made him an offer in a voice so reasonable it barely sounded like the woman with the microphone. "Joint attribution," she said. "Ashford and Brooks. I'll put you in front of the committee myself. I'll write the letters. And there isn't a program in this country that would turn you down afterward. You take the fellowship money. All of it. I take the paper." Preston set his keys down on the table. "No. You don't have a degree," Victoria said. "You don't have a department. You don't have a single person who can vouch for you. And in 4 days, you are going to walk into a room full of people who have already decided what you are. Without my name on it, they won't read it. They'll read you." "Then they'll read me," Preston said. She was at the door when she stopped and looked back. And for the first time since the colloquium, there was nothing performed in her face at all. "You should have taken it," she said. She began that same night, and she was methodical about it, because she was methodical about everything. Victoria invented nothing. That was the part that made it work. Every item she assembled over the next 3 days was true, and she laid them side by side in a way that made a shape none of them made alone. For 15 years, an employee of custodial services had entered a secured academic facility outside authorized hours and altered materials on faculty chalkboards, and there was footage because she had requested it herself. That same employee now had exclusive overnight access to room 314 with no faculty oversight of any kind. And Professor Emeritus Harold Webb, 19 years on the faculty at Ridgemont, had badged into Holloway at 2:11-2:40 and 1:58 in the morning on 3 separate nights, going directly to the 3rd floor each time. Ridgemont was where an unfinished line of work on the same conjecture had circulated informally among graduate students for decades. Victoria had come from Ridgemont. She knew exactly which drawer to point at. And then, in a records request that took a day and a half, she learned that Preston Brooks had himself been a doctoral student there 15 years earlier and had withdrawn without completing. She sat looking at that for a long time. She had not known. Nobody at Whitmore had known. The honest thing to do with it, the thing a person of any character would have done, was to walk into the provost's office and say, "This man has 3 years of graduate training, and we owe him an apology." Instead, she filed a formal complaint of research misconduct with the Office of Academic Integrity on the morning of day 12. The allegation was not that Preston Brooks was a fraud in the ordinary sense. It was cleverer than that. It alleged that unpublished Ridgemont material work that did not belong to him and had never been credited had been passed to an unqualified individual by a former Ridgemont faculty member, and that the resulting presentation would constitute misrepresentation of authorship. She never had to prove it. She only had to file it. The Office of Academic Integrity had a standing procedure, and the procedure did not care whose framework was rotten. At 2 that afternoon, a compliance officer and a security officer went to the 3rd floor and sealed room 314 with a printed notice taped across the door. Every sheet of paper in the room was collected, inventoried, and placed into evidence 160 pages of Preston's handwriting, 9 days of it, along with Webb's 3 gray volumes, and the chalkboard, which they photographed and then erased. Harold Webb was suspended from all campus privileges the same afternoon pending review. His card was deactivated. He was 73 years old, and he had to be walked out of a building he had entered freely for 9 years by a security officer who kept apologizing the whole way to the parking lot. Preston learned all of this at 10 that night when he clocked in and found Ray Doyle waiting. "I'm supposed to take your room key," Doyle said. "That's all. Nobody said anything about your shift." Preston unclipped it and handed it over. The story reached the public the next morning in the worst possible shape. There was already a video of a janitor humiliating a dean. Now there was also a line in the campus paper confirming that the university was reviewing an allegation of research misconduct against the man in it. Nobody printed the word fraud. Nobody had to. The internet did the rest inside a day, because a story about a hidden genius is only interesting once, and a story about a hidden genius who turns out to be a liar is interesting all over again. The clip got recut with new captions. He didn't solve anything. Stolen work. 15 years of access to an empty building, think about that. Someone found the address of the apartment building. Nobody came, but the fact that they could have sat in Preston's chest like a stone. He worked his shift on day 12 and his shift on day 13 all the way through because he could not afford not to, and because there was nowhere else to be. He mopped the humanities corridor at 3 in the morning while his own name went past on other people's phones. He had 1 day left. He had no room, no notes, no board, no volumes, and no Herald Webb. What he had was the green notebook which had been in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket on the afternoon the compliance officer came through the door, because it had been in that pocket every day for 5 years. That was the only reason they had not taken it too. Lily came home crying on the afternoon of day 13. She got off the bus at 3:10 and walked past her father without looking at him, and she was inside before he understood that anything was wrong. He found her on the edge of her bed with her backpack still on both shoulders and her face wet and furious. It took him a while to get it out of her. A boy in her class had shown a phone around at lunch. There were 4 of them by the end of it, and one girl she had thought was her friend. And the thing they kept saying all afternoon and out to the bus loop was that her dad was a thief who had stolen somebody else's homework, and everyone in the country knew about it now. I told them it wasn't true, Lily said. And then they asked me what you did, and I said you work at the university. She stopped there, and then she said the rest of it in a smaller voice, and it went through Preston like a blade. And they said, doing what? He sat down on the floor with his back against her bed frame because his legs had stopped being reliable. His daughter was 10 years old, and she had never once been ashamed of him. He had built the entire architecture of 15 years around making sure of that. The early shift, the breakfast, the hour of sleep, the uniform hung in the closet where she would not have to look at it. He had thought what he was protecting her from was need. He understood on the floor of her bedroom that it had always been this, and that he had failed at it by finally reaching for the one thing he had wanted for himself in 5 years. I'm going to fix it, he said. How? He did not have an answer for her. He made dinner. She ate about half of it, and he sat with her until she fell asleep at 9. Mrs. Delacroix came up at 10 and found him standing in the kitchen with his jacket on and one hand flat on the counter, not moving. He clocked in at 10:15 and ran the route, and at 10 minutes to 2 in the morning, he came into the ground floor lecture hall of Holloway with his cart, because it was still on the route, and nobody had taken that away from him, and because the hearing that would end him in 9 hours had been booked into this room, and Victoria had never thought to move it. The obstruction was gone from the board. Somebody had erased it in the previous 2 days, and the long chalkboards on their tracks were blank and gray and faintly streaked. Preston sat down in the front row with the stub of pencil from the cart and the green notebook in his hands and opened it at the beginning. Clara's handwriting got smaller as the years went on, and then in the last 11 pages, it got larger again and less steady, and he made himself keep going into those pages which he almost never did. She had written them in the hospital, and she had known by then. She had asked for the notebook on the Tuesday, and he had gone home to get it, and she had worked in it on and off for 3 weeks with a pencil she held in her fist like a child. None of it was organized. Some of it trailed off mid-line. On the second to last page, there was a half-worked construction he had never been able to make sense of, and he had assumed for 5 years that it was the illness in it. And on the last page alone, underlined twice, there was a single sentence. Stop trying to make it whole. Ask what it's allowed to break. He had read that sentence perhaps 400 times, and had always understood it as a message to him, the last thing his wife ever said to him about anything, a piece of consolation dressed up as mathematics. For 5 years, he had carried it in his jacket and taken it exactly that way. He was looking at it now, for the 401st time at 2 in the morning, 13 days, into being told by an entire university what he was. And this time, he read the line above it. Not the sentence the half-worked construction on the page before. It was not consolation at all. She had not been writing to him. She had been working right up to the end on the same wall he had spent 15 years walking into, and she had not been trying to get through it. She had been asking what happened if you let it fail. Preston stood up out of the seat. Every attempt in 30 years of literature, every candidate Victoria had put at it every night in room 314, had been an attempt to preserve a condition through the transition. That was what everyone assumed the problem was. That was what made it a wall. And Clara, dying with nothing left to lose and no career left to protect, had done the one thing none of them were willing to do. She had let the condition break on purpose and gone to look at what was on the other side. There was something on the other side of it. He went up the 3 steps, took a piece of chalk out of the tray, and began to write on a board that had been wiped clean 2 days earlier by people who thought they were taking something away from him. It came out of him for 4 hours without stopping. At 6 in the morning, the sky over the parking lot was going gray, and Preston Brooks stood in front of 16 feet of chalkboard shaking, looking at a complete proof. At 6:15, Preston did the only thing he could think of. He tore a sheet from the pad on his cart, wrote, "Do not erase." P. Brooks custodial on it in block letters, taped it to the frame of the board, and called Ray Doyle at home and woke him up. "You want me to what?" Doyle said. "Lock Holloway. Ground floor lecture hall. Nobody in it until 11. There was a long space on the other end of the line and a television going somewhere behind it. "They'll ask me who authorized that. Then tell them the floors are wet," Preston said. Doyle drove in at 7 and locked the doors himself. He stood outside them for 4 hours with a folding sign that said the room was closed for maintenance, turned away a professor of statistics and 31 undergraduates, and never once explained himself. Preston went home, made his daughter breakfast, and did not sleep. He transcribed the whole thing at the kitchen table in 3 hours, 16 feet of board reduced to 22 pages in pencil, then put on a clean uniform, because it was the only clothing he owned that he had ever been respected in, and drove back at 10:30. There were 9 faculty on the review committee, the provost and a compliance officer from the Office of Academic Integrity, with a folder in front of her. In the seats behind them were close to 180 people who had come, because word had gone around, and nobody thought to close the doors. 2 were reporters. Several dozen were students who had laughed in that room 14 days earlier. Victoria Ashford sat at the end of the committee table as chair of the department, recused without a vote, because she had filed the complaint that was being heard. Grace Whitfield was in the front row. Harold Webb was in the third in his raincoat, because Nathaniel Reed had telephoned him personally at 8 that morning and told him that a suspension of campus privileges did not extend to a public hearing at which he was named, and that if anyone stopped him at the door, they could take it up with the provost. Preston came in at 10:59 with 22 pages under his arm and his keys clipped at his hip. Somebody at the back had already noticed the sign taped to the board frame. The room was very quiet. "Mr. Brooks," Reed said, "you understand there are 2 matters before this committee, and they've been combined at the request of Academic Integrity. The allegation and the deadline. You're entitled to address either." "I'd rather do the second one," Preston said. "I think it answers the first." He set the pages on the table and did not open them. He went to the board instead, took the sheet of paper off the frame, and for the next 50 minutes, walked 9 faculty members and 180 spectators through a proof that had been written on that surface at 4 in the morning by a man who had not slept in 21 hours. He did it slowly. He named every source he had used and where it came from, including the 3 gray volumes and the man who had lent them, and he said Harold Webb's name out loud twice in the first 10 minutes, which is the opposite of what a person hiding something does. He restated Victoria's framework, honestly showed again where it failed, gave her credit for the 2 years of structure that survived the failure, and did not editorialize. And then he came to the transition, the wall, the 30-year gap, the place where every published attempt had stopped and turned around. And the room began to lean forward because everyone in it who understood the subject knew that this was where it ended. Everybody who has come at this, Preston said, has tried to carry the boundedness condition through, including me, for 15 years. He wrote the condition on the board and drew a line under it. That's the mistake. It isn't a wall. It's a door that only opens if you're willing to let this break. He set the chalk against the surface, so let it break, and then go look at what's on the other side. He wrote for 9 minutes and nobody interrupted him. When he stopped, a professor of analysis named Curtis Hanley got up out of his seat at the committee table, walked to the board, and stood in front of the last third of it, with his glasses pushed onto his forehead reading. 2 others joined him. Grace Whitfield came up from the front row without being invited, and nobody sent her back. They worked through it in front of everyone. It took 26 minutes. The compliance officer sat with her unopened folder and waited because there was nothing in it that applied anymore. Hanley turned around and addressed the provost rather than the room. "It closes," he said. Victoria Ashford sat at the end of the table with her hands folded and her eyes on the board and did not look away from it, not once. Not through any of it. Because she was the only person in Holloway Hall who had already known for 4 days that it was going to close and had filed a misconduct complaint instead. The Office of Academic Integrity withdrew the allegation 9 days later in a finding that said in the flat language of such documents that no unpublished material from any institution had been used, that the loan of published proceedings by a professor emeritus constituted ordinary academic collegiality, and that the complaint should not have proceeded to sealing and seizure on the evidence available when it was filed. Harold Webb's suspension was vacated with a written apology from the provost's office. His card was reactivated on a Monday. He used it that afternoon to walk into Holloway at a perfectly reasonable hour for the first time in a month. Preston's 160 pages came back to him in the same cardboard box they had been carried out in. The fellowship was simpler than anyone expected. Its terms had never mentioned job titles or degrees, only that the gap be closed and the result defended before the faculty. The 14-day clock had been Victoria's invention, not the endowment's, and Preston had beaten it anyway. $60,000 and a named research position went to a man whose employment record at Whitmore University listed him as night custodial staff, grade 2, and Reed signed it without asking anyone's permission. The video went around the world, not the first one. What went out this time was the 2 of them cut together solve it. And I'll marry you, the laughter the bucket set down against the baseboard. And then, 14 days later, the same room, the same board, and Curtis Hanley turning around to say 2 words to the provost. Somebody set it to music. Somebody else stripped the music out and put the whole 50 minutes up unedited. And that version got watched more, which surprised everybody except the people who had been in the room. The accounts that had run stolen work to their followers ran corrections. Some of them. Victoria went home the night of the hearing and did not come in the next day or the day after. She had spent 10 months believing that the thing she could not survive was being wrong in public. What she had actually not survived was one evening in the middle of October when she had stood alone in room 314, seen where it was going, understood that a man with no degree and no department was about to do the thing she had built her framework to do, and had gone to the Office of Academic Integrity instead of going to him. Nobody made her resign. That was the part she thought about most afterward. Reed never asked. Hanley never asked. She resigned as chair in a letter that took her 9 drafts and came out 2 paragraphs long, and in it she stated plainly what she had known and when she had known it, and asked that the letter be entered into the department record rather than kept confidential. She did not resign her professorship. Reed refused that part and told her that leaving would be easier than staying, and that she had not earned easier. She found Preston in the lecture hall at 4 in the morning 3 weeks later, mopping the center aisle. "They'll want your name on the paper with mine," he said before she could start. "Hanley told me. 2 years of your structure is still in it, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. I've already agreed. I know what's still in it." Victoria stood at the end of the row with her coat over her arm. "I'm not here about the paper." She said the rest of it standing there, and it was not graceful, and it took her some time. She named the colloquium, and the microphone, and the complaint, and she did not once use the word mistake, which Preston noticed, and which was probably the only reason he believed her. She did not ask him to accept it. When she was finished, he rested both hands on the mop handle and looked at her. "You should say some of that to Harold Webb," he said. "He's 73. They walked him out of a building. I'm going there next." The Whitmore Award for Distinguished Research was presented in the spring in an auditorium with better carpet than Holloway Hall and a stage with a lectern on it, and the university had made a considerable effort to find out Preston Brooks's suit size. He wore the uniform. It was gray, and the crest on the chest had gone the color of dishwater from 15 years of washing, and he walked out onto that stage in it, with his keys clipped at his hip, and the sound the room made was not the sound Holloway Hall had made in October. Lily was in the second row with Mrs. Delacroix on one side of her, and Harold Webb on the other. She was 11 now. She had told 3 separate people at school that week what her father did, and had said the word janitor first, and the rest of it second in that order on purpose. Preston spoke for 4 minutes. He said that he had mopped the corridors outside those doors and the floor of every room in the mathematics building at 2 in the morning for 15 years, and that during all of it, he had been exactly the same person standing in front of them now. He said the work was not his alone. He named Harold Webb, who had knocked on a door at 2 in the morning when it cost him something to do it. He named Ray Doyle, who had locked a lecture hall and told everyone the floors were wet. He named Grace Whitfield, who had walked up to a board in front of 180 people and checked his proof line by line when it would have been safer to stay in her seat. And he named Clara Brooks, who had asked the right question from a hospital bed with a pencil she could barely hold, and who had been 3 years ahead of him once and would have been 3 years ahead of him still. Then he said the thing he had come to say, which was short. A person's worth isn't in the job they hold or the clothes they're wearing when you meet them. It's in what they can do, what they keep doing when nobody's watching, and how they treat people who can't do anything for them. If you had asked anyone in this university what I was, for 15 years, they'd have all given you the same answer. Every one of them would have been wrong. Be careful what you decide about somebody from across a room. He was interrupted twice. Afterward, in the corridor, a student who had been in Holloway Hall in October asked the question the internet had been asking in some form for 6 months, whether the dean had ever made good on it. "She said she'd marry you," the kid said, "if you solved it." "She said a lot of things that day," Preston said. "She didn't owe me a wedding. She owed Harold Webb an apology, and she gave him one, and it took her longer than it took her to write the letter." He took the doctoral fellowship at Whitmore that fall, fully funded with Curtis Hanley as his advisor, and a paper already in review carrying 2 names on it. He was 47 years old, the oldest person in his cohort by 15 years, and he kept the night shift for the first 4 months anyway, because the household ran on it, and because he had never in his life been able to think properly before 2 in the morning. Room 314 was assigned to him permanently. He taped a photograph inside the door, a woman with dark hair pulled back badly, laughing at something outside the frame, one hand shielding a page from the wind.